Now, well, I think I learned very early on that a quick way to burn out in open source is to treat it as a business, as though your users are customers, as though they have claims of legitimacy on your time and your attention and your direction.
Mhm.
Because I faced this almost immediately with Ruby on Rails. As soon as it was released, there were a million people who had all sorts of opinions about where I ought to take it. And not just opinions, but actually demands. Unless you implement an Oracle database adapter, this is always going to be a toy. It was actually more or less that exact demand that prompted me to have a slide at one of the early Rails conferences that just said, fuck you.
Yeah, I saw that.
I'm not going to do what you tell me to. I'm here as a bringer of gift. I am sharing code that I wrote on my own time, on my own volition. And you don't have to say thank you. I mean, it'd be nice if you did. You can take the code and do whatever you want with it. You can contribute back if you want, but you can't tell me what to do or where to go or how to act. I'm not a vendor. This is a fundamental misconception that users of open source occasionally step into because they're used to buying software from companies who really care about their business. I care about people using my software. I think it's great. But we don't have a transactional relationship. I don't get something back when you tell me what to do, except grief. And I don't want it, so you can keep it. So my open source philosophy from the start has been, I got to do this primarily for me. I love when other people find use in my open source. It's not my primary motivation. I'm not primarily doing it for other people. I'm primarily doing it for me and my own objectives because, as Adam Smith said, it's not for the benevolence of the butcher that we expect our daily meat. It's for his self-interest. And I actually find that to be a beautiful thought, that our comments increase in value when we all pursue our self-interest, certainly in the realm of open source. This is also why I reject this notion that open source is in some sort of crisis, that there's a funding crisis, that we have to spend more. No, we don't. Open source has never been doing better. Open source has never controlled more domains in software than it has right now. There is no crisis. There's a misconception from some people making open source and from a lot of people using open source that open source is primarily like commercial software, something you buy and something where you can then make demands as a customer and that the customer is always right. The customer is not always right, not even in business, but certainly not in open source. In open source, the customer as it is a receiver of gifts. We are having a gift exchange. I show up and give you my code. If you like it, you can use it. And if you have some code that fits in with where I'm going with this, I would love to get those gifts back. And we can keep trading like that. I give you more gifts. You give me some of your gifts. Together, we pool all the gifts such that someone showing up brand new just get a mountain of gifts. This is the magic thing of open source is it increases the total sum value of what's in the commons when we all pursue our own self-interest. So I'm building things for Rails that I need. And you know what? You want me to do that. You do not want me to build things that I don't need on behalf of other people because I'll do a crap job. I build much better software when I can evaluate the quality of that software by my own use. I need this feature. I'm going to build a good version of that feature, and I'm going to build just enough just for me. So I'm not going to bloat it. I'm not trying to attract a customer here. I'm not trying to see some angle. I'm just building what I need. And if you go into open source with that mentality that you're building for you and everything else is a bonus, I think you have all the ingredients to go to distance. I think the people who burn out in open source is when they go in thinking, I'm making all these gifts. I don't really need them myself, but I'm like hoping someone else does, and maybe they'll also give me some money. That's a losing proposition. It never basically works. If you want money for your software, you should just sell it. We have a perfectly fine model of commercial software that people can make that kind and then they can sell it. But I find a lot of confusion, let's just call it that politely, in open source contributors who want to have their cake and eat it too. They like the mode of working with open source. They maybe even like the status that comes from open source, but they also would like to earn a living from making that open source. And therefore, they occasionally end up with the kind of grievances that someone who feels underappreciated at work will develop when others aren't doing enough to recognize their great gifts.
And then they might walk away. I wish I had more insight into their mind state of the individual people that are running these projects. Like if they're feeling sad or they need more money or they're like, it's just such a dark box.
It can be.
I mean, of course, there's some communication, but I just sadly see too often they just kind of walk away.
Right. And I think that's actually also part of the beauty of open source.
Just walk
You are
away.
not obligated to do this code forever.
Yeah.
You're obligated to do this for as long as you want to do it.
Mhm.
That's basically your own obligation.
But there is, I know. Okay, so you might criticize this and push back. You did write a blog post on forever, until the end of the internet with to-do list. There is a beautiful aspect, and you found a good balance there. But I don't know. You're bringing so much joy to people with this thing you created. It's not an obligation, but there's a real beauty to taking care of this thing you've created.
There is.
And not forgetting. I think what the open source creator is not seeing enough. I mean, there's like how many lives you're making better. There's certain pieces of software that I just quietly use a lot,
Yes.
and like they bring my life joy. And I wish I could communicate that well. There's ways to donate, but it's inefficient. It's usually hard to donate.
It is. There's some ways for some people that made it easier. GitHub donations is one way of doing it. I donate to a few people, even though I don't love the paradigm. I also accept that we can have multiple paradigms. I accept that I can do open source for one set of motivations and other people can do open source for other motivations. We don't all have to do it the same way. But I do want to counter the misconception that open source is somehow in a crisis unless we all start paying for open source. That model already exists. It's commercial software. It works very well, and plenty of great companies have been built off the back of it, and the expectations are very clear. I pay you this amount, and I get this software. Open source, once you start mixing money into it, gets real muddy real fast. And a lot of it is just from those misaligned expectations. That if you feel like you're starving artists as an open source developer and you are owed X amount of money because your software is popular, you're delusional. And you need to knock that off. Just get back on track where you realize that you're putting gifts into the world. And if you get something back in terms of monetary compensation, okay, that's a bonus. But if you need that money back in terms of monetary compensation, you should just charge for software or go work for a software company that will employ you to do open source. There's tons of that. That is probably actually the primary mode that open source software is being developed in the world today. Commercial companies making open source that they need themselves and then contributing it back.
So I'm glad you brought up, sort of like drew some hard lines here. It's a good moment to bring up what I think is maybe one of the greatest open source projects ever, WordPress. And you spoke up in October 24 about some of the stuff that's been going on with WordPress's founder, Matt Mullenweg, in a blog post, Open Source Royalty and Mad Kings. It's a really good blog post on sort of just the idea of benevolent dictators for life, this model for open source projects. And then the basic implication was that Matt, as the BDFL of WordPress, has lost his way a bit with his battle with WP Engine. So I should also say that I really love WordPress. It brings me joy. I think it's a beacon of what open source could be. I think it's made the internet better. It allowed a lot of people to create wonderful websites. And I also think, now you might disagree with this, but from everything I've seen, WP Engine just gives me bad vibes. I think they're not the good guy in this. I don't like it. I understand the frustration. I understand all of it, but I don't think that excuses the behavior. There's a bit of this kind of counter to a little bit what you said, which is when you have an open source project of that size, there is a bit of like when you're the king, that for a project of a kingdom that large, there's a bit of responsibility. Anyway, could you speak to your maybe to your empathy of Matt and to your criticism and maybe paint a path of how he and WordPress can be winning again?
First, I'd echo what you said about what a wonderful thing it is that WordPress exists. There are not many projects in the open source world or in the world at large that has had as big of an impact on the internet as WordPress has. He deserves a ton of accolades for that work. So that was my engagement, essentially, my premise. Do you know what? I had tremendous respect for what Matt has built with WordPress, what that entire ecosystem has built around itself. It's a true marvel. But there's some principles that are larger than my personal sympathies to the characters involved. I agree. The Silver Lake private equity company that's involved with WP Engine, is not my natural ally. I'm not the natural ally of private equity doing some game with VP Engine. That's not my interest in the case. My interest is essentially a set of principles. And the principles are, if you release something as open source, people are free to use it as they see fit, and they are free to donate code or resources or money back to the community as they see fit. You may disagree about whether they've done enough, whether they should do more, but you can't show up after you've given the gift of free software to the world and then say, now that you've used that gift, you actually owe me a huge slice of your business because you got too successful using the thing I gave you for free. You don't get to take a gift back. That's why we have open source licenses. They stipulate exactly what the obligations are on both sides of the equation. The users of open source don't get to demand what the makers of open source do and how they act. And the makers of open source don't get to suddenly show up with a ransom note to the users and say, actually, you owe me for all sorts of use. I'm 100% allergic to that kind of interaction. And I think Matt, unfortunately, for whatever reason, got so wrapped up in what he was owed that he failed to realize what he was destroying. WordPress and Automatic already makes a ton of money. This is part of the wonder of WordPress. This is a project that generates hundreds of millions of dollars. And Matt didn't feel like he was getting enough of that. That's not a good argument, bro. You can't just violate the spirit and the letter of these open source licenses and just start showing up with demand letters, even to characters that are not particularly sympathetic. This goes to the root of my interpretation of open source in general. The GPL is a particular license that actually demands code from people who use it under certain circumstances. I've never liked the GPL. I don't want your shitty code if you don't want to give it to me. What am I going to do with that? Some code dump that I'm not on board with that part of Stallman's vision at all. I love the MIT license. To me, that is the perfect license because it is mercifully short. I think it's 2 paragraphs, 3 paragraphs, really short. And it basically says, here's some software. It comes with no warranty. You can't sue me. You can't demand anything, but you can do whatever the hell you want with it. Have a nice life. That's a perfect open source interaction, in my opinion. And that license needs to be upheld. These licenses in general, even the GPL, even if I don't like it, we have to abide by them. Because if we just set aside those licenses when we, in a moment's notice, feel like something slightly unfair, we've lost everything. We've lost the entire framework that allowed open source to prosper and allowed open source to become such an integral part of commerce, too. I mean, back when open source was initially finding its feet, it was at war with commercial software. Stallman is at war with commercial software and always has been. Bill Gates was in return at war with open source for the longest time. The open source licenses and the clarity that they provide allowed us to end that war. Today, commercial software and open source software can peacefully coexist. I make commercial software, I sell Basecamp, I sell HEY, and then I also make a bunch of open source software that I give away for free as gifts. That can't happen if we start violating these contracts. No commercial company is going to go, let me base my next project off this piece of open source if I'm also running the liability that some mad maker is going to show up 7 years in and demand I give them $50 million. That's not an environment conducive to commerce, collaboration, or anything else. And it's just basically wrong. I think there's one analysis that's all about kind of the practical outcomes of this, which I think are bad. There's also an argument that's simply about ethics. This is not right. You can't just show up afterwards and demand something. This is not too dissimilar, in my opinion, to the whole Apple thing we talked about earlier. Apple just showing up and feeling like they're entitled to 30% of everyone's business. No, that's not right. That's not fair. So I think Matt, unfortunately, kind of stared himself blind on the indignity he thought was being perpetrated against him because there was all this money being made by VP Engine making a good product and not giving quite enough back, in Matt's opinion. Tough cookie.
I think maybe I'm reading too much into it, but there might be some personal stuff too, which they weren't not only not giving enough, but probably implicitly promising that they will give and then taking advantage of him in that way in his mind. It's just like interpersonal interaction, and then
Sure.
and then you get like interpersonally frustrated. You
I get
forget
that.
like the bigger picture ethics of it. It's like when a guy keeps saying, promising he'll do something,
Sure.
and then you realize you wake up one day like a year or two later. Wait a minute, I was being lied to this whole time, and that I don't even know if it's about money.
I get mad too. It's totally fine to get mad when people disappoint you. That's not justification for
Yeah.
upending decades of open source licensees and the essential de facto case law we've established around it. This is why I chose to even weigh in on this, because I like WordPress. I don't use WordPress. I'm not a part of that community. I don't actually have a dog in this fight. I'm biased, if anything, towards Matt, just as a fellow BDFL.
Mhm.
I would like to see him do well with this, but I also think there's some principles at stake here that ring much louder. I don't want Rails to suddenly be tainted by the fact that it's open source and whether companies can rely on it and build businesses on it, because wait, maybe one day I'm going to turn Matt and I'm going to turn Matt King and I'm going to show up with a demand ransom letter. No, screw that. We have way more to protect here. There's way more at stake than your personal beef with someone or your perceived grievance over what you're owed.
What would you recommend? What do you think you can do to walk it back to heal?
Decide. This is the curious thing. He could decide to give this up. That's very, very difficult for driven, ambitious people to do, to accept that they're wrong and to give up and lay down their sword. So I had a hope earlier on in this that was possible. I haven't seen any evidence that Matt is interested in that, and I find that deeply regretful, but that's his prerogative. I continue to speak out when he's violating the spirit and ethics of open source, but I wish he would just accept that this was a really bad idea. He made a bad bet, and I think he thought he'd just get away with it, that they'd just pay up and that he could put pressure. I mean, I know that temptation. When you sit as the head of a very important project, you know that comes with a great degree of power, and you really need a great degree of discipline to rein that in and not exercise that power at every step where you feel aggrieved. I've felt aggrieved a million times over in the 20 plus years of Ruby on Rails. I've really tried very hard not to let those sometimes petty, sometimes substantial grievances over time seep in to the foundation of the ecosystem and risk ruining everything.
As the king of the Rail Kingdom, has the power gotten to your head over the years?
I'm sure it has. I mean, who wouldn't?
Do you pace around in your chamber?
I do, occasionally. And I do marvel at both what's been built, what's been possible. Over 1 million applications have been made with Ruby on Rails by one estimate that I've seen. Businesses like Shopify and GitHub and a million others have been built on top of something that I started. That's very gratifying. But you really have to be careful not to smell your own exhaust too much. And you have to be just as careful not to listen too much to the haters and not to listen too much to the superfans either. That you assess the value and the sort of principles of what you're working towards on its own merits, on your own scoreboard. I try to block that out and then just go, well, I'm working on Rails because I love to write Ruby. I love to use Ruby to make web applications. That's my North Star, and I'll continue to do that, and I'll continue to share all of the open source gifts that I uncover along the ways. And that's it. That's enough, too. I don't have to get all of it out of it. This is sometimes, just as with the guy who thought I'd given up on being Jira or something instead of doing Basecamp, there are people over the years who've asked, like, why didn't you charge for Rails? Like, don't you know how much money have been made off Rails? If we just look at something like Shopify, it's worth billions of dollars. I'm not a billionaire, and so freaking what? I got more than enough. I got plenty of my share. I will say, though, I'm also introspective enough to realize that if it hadn't panned out as well as it did for me on my own business, maybe I would have been more tempted. Maybe if you see other people build huge, successful companies off the back of your work and you really don't have a pot to piss in, you might be tempted to get a little upset about that. I've seen that in the Rails world as well, where there are people who contributed substantial bodies of work and then got really miffed when they didn't feel like they got enough back. I was fortunate enough that the business that Jason and I built with Ruby on Rails was as successful as it was. And I made the money I needed to make, that I didn't need to chase the rest of it.
But we should also just make explicit that many people in your position chase the money. It's not that difficult to chase. Basically, you turned away money. You made a lot of decisions that just turn away money.
Maybe. I also think of this example with Matt. He probably thought there was easy money for the taking, and it wasn't so easy, was it? It looked like low-hanging dollar bills, and they turned out to be some really sour grapes. It turned out he probably destroyed vast sums of money by undermining the whole WordPress trust and the ecosystem and putting question marks in the heads of folks who would choose to use WordPress or something else going forward. So I often think when people think like, oh, you left money on the table. First of all, so what? I don't have to have all the money. But second of all, maybe the money wasn't on the table at all.
And maybe the cost, even if you got the money, maybe the cost in other ways,
Yes.
like we've talked about,
Yes.
would outweigh all the money that you could have possibly gotten. Meaning, like, I think you said that the thing that makes you happy is flow and tranquility. Those two things.
Yes.
Really beautifully put. And, gaining money might assign to you a responsibility of running a larger thing that takes away the flow that you gain from being from fundamentally for you. What flow means is programming, and that tranquility is like, I think you also have a beautiful post of like nirvana is an empty schedule.
When I look at a upcoming week and I see that I have no scheduled meetings at all, which is quite common, or maybe I just have one thing for 1 hour on one day, I think to myself, do you know what? This could very easily have been very different. We could have been running a company of hundreds of people or thousands of people, and my entire calendar would have been packed solid with little Tetris blocks of other people's demands on my attention and time, and I would have been miserable as fuck.
Yep.
And I look at that and go like, that, what more can I ask for? Which is a really nice state of being, I'd actually say. I didn't have this always. I did have early on in my career some sense of like, I need a little more security. And I remember this really interesting study where a bunch of researchers asked people who had made certain amounts of money, how much money would it take for you to feel secure? They'd ask people who had $1 million net worth, how much money do you need? Probably need 2 million. 2 million, then it'd be good. Then they ask people with a net worth of 5 million, how much do you need? 10. I need 10. Ask people with 10 million, what do you need? 20. Every single time people would need double of what they did. I did that for a couple of doublings until I realized, you know what, this is silly.
Yeah.
I am already where I wished I would be and 1,000,000 times over. So what less is there to pursue? Now, that doesn't mean that if more money is coming my way, I'm going to say no to it. Of course not. But it does mean that I'm free to set other things higher. And I also do think you realize, as Jim Carrey would say, I wish everyone would get all the money that they wished for and they'd realize it wasn't the answer. That money solves a whole host of problems and anxieties, and then it creates a bunch of new ones. And then it also doesn't touch a huge swath of the human experience at all. The world is full of miserable, anxious, hurt, rich people. It's also full of miserable, anxious, poor people, and I'd rather be a miserable, anxious, rich person than a poor person. But it isn't this magic wand that make everything go away. And that's, again, one of those insights, just like having children, that you cannot communicate in words. I've never been able to persuade a person who's not wealthy that wealth wasn't going to solve all their problems.
One quote you've returned to often that I enjoy a lot is the Coco Chanel quote of the best things in life are free, and the second best things are very, very expensive. And I guess the task is to focus on surrounding yourself with the best things in life, like family and all of this, and not caring about the other stuff.
I would even say you can care about the other stuff. Just know the order of priority.
Yeah.
If you are blessed with a partner that you love, some children that you adore, you've already won the greatest prize that most humans are able to achieve. Most humans in this world, if they are of marital age and they have children, if you ask them what's the most important thing, they would all say that. They would all say that, no matter whether they're rich or poor. It's easy to lose sight of that when you're chasing the second best things. Because you know what? They're also very nice.
Mm-hmm.
I really like that Pagani Zonda. It was a very expensive car, and I would have no chance of acquiring it if I hadn't become rather successful in business. So I don't want to dismiss it either. It's great fun to have money. It's just not as fun for quite as long or as deep as you think it is. And these other things, having an occupation and a pursuit that you enjoy, being able to carry burdens with a stiff upper lip and with, again, a sense of meaning is incredible. To have family, to have friends, to have hobbies, to have all these things that are actually available to most people around the world, that's winning. And it doesn't mean you have to discount your ambitions. It doesn't mean you can't reach for more. But it does mean it's pretty dumb if you don't realize that it's not going to complete you in some hocus pocus woo sense to make more. It really isn't.
What gives you hope about the future of this whole thing we have going on here, human civilization?
I find it easier to be optimistic than pessimistic because I don't know either way. So if I get to choose, why not just choose to believe it's going to pan out?
Yeah.
Like, we suffer more in our imagination than we do in reality. That's one of the quotes out of Stoicism. And I also think we have a tendency, a lot of humans have a tendency, to be pessimistic in advance for things they don't know how it's going to pan out. Climate change, for example, is making a lot of people very anxious and very pessimistic about the future. You know nothing. 40 years ago, we thought the problem was that the planet was going to be too cool. I happen to believe that it's probably correct that the planet is getting too hot and that CO2 has something to do with it. Whether we have the right measures to fix it in time, if that's even possible or not, is completely up in the air, and we don't know. If you convince yourself with such certainty that the world is going to turn to shit, it is. Right up here in your head today. Climate change might wipe out this entire species in 200 years. It's not next year. It's not 10 years from now. Your life might become more unpleasant and there might be more negative effects and so on. Yes, okay. But then deal with that hardship when it arrives. Don't take that in advance. How are you helping Earth by just walking around being depressed?
I think our whole conversation today is also an indication it's just two humans talking. There's billions of us. And there is something about us that wants to solve problems and build cool stuff.
Yes.
And so we're going to build our way out of whatever shit we get ourselves into. This is what humans do. We create problems for ourselves and come up, figure out how to build rocket ships to get out of those problems. And sometimes the rocket ships create other problems like nuclear warheads. And then we'll, I'm sure, I hope, figure out ways how to avoid those problems. And then there'll be nanobots, and then the aliens will come, and there'll be a massive war between the nanobots and the aliens, and that will bring also all of us humans together.
The funny thing, just to pick up one of the points you mentioned, the atom bomb, for example. When that was first invented, a lot of people thought we have essentially ended life on Earth, right? Or maybe we prevented World War III from happening in the past 80 years because assured mutual annihilation kept the superpowers from attacking each other, at least head on, and kept their fighting to proxy wars. You know what? Proxy wars are not great, but they're probably better than World War III with nuclear weapons. So it's quite difficult in the moment to tell what's actually benefit and what's not. And I think we should be a bit more humble. I've certainly become more humble over time of thinking I know which way it's going to turn. I think the pandemic was a huge moment for a lot of people where there was so much certainty about whether this intervention worked or that intervention didn't work. And most people were wrong. Certainly a lot of very smart people, very qualified people got that just utterly and catastrophizingly wrong. So just a little intellectual humility. I think back upon that and go like, you know what? I'm not a PhD in virology. And I don't claim that like I somehow saw how it all was going to play out. But the people who were really experts in that, they got a bunch of it wrong. Nobody knows anything. I keep reminding myself of that every day. No one knows anything. We can't predict the economy a month out. We can't predict world affairs a month out. The world is just too complicated.
Yeah, when I watched the Netflix documentary Chimp Empire and how, there's a hierarchy of chimps, all of that looks eerily similar to us humans. We're recent descendants. So these experts, some of the chimps got a PhD, others don't. Others are really muscular. Others are like beta male kind. They're sucking up to the alpha. There's a lot of interesting dynamics going on that really maps cleanly to the geopolitics of the day. They don't have nuclear weapons, but the nature of their behavior is similar to ours. So I think we barely know what's going on. But I do think there's like a basic will to cooperate. There's a basic compassion that underlies just the human spirit that's there. And maybe that is just me being optimistic. But if that is indeed there, I think we're going to be okay.
The capacity is certainly there.
Yeah.
Whether we choose that capacity or not, who knows and in what situation. I think accepting that we all have the capacity for both ways, for both incredible generosity and kindness and also cruelty. I think Jung, with his whole theory of the shadow, was really spot on, that we all have that capacity in us, and accepting that it's our job to attempt to cultivate the better parts of our human nature is weighed against our propensity to sometimes be the worst of ourselves.
I'm excited to find out what's going to happen. It's so awesome to be human. I don't want to die. I kind of want to be alive for a while to see all the cool shit we do. And one of the cool things I want to see is all the software you create and all the things you tweet, all the trouble you get yourself into on Twitter. David, yeah, I'm a huge fan. Like I said, thank you for everything you've done for the world, for the millions of developers you've inspired, and one of whom is me. And thank you for this awesome conversation, brother.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to this conversation with DHH. To support this podcast, please check out our sponsors in the description and consider subscribing to this channel. And now, let me leave you with some words from Rework by DHH and Jason Fried. What you do is what matters, not what you think or say or plan. Thank you for listening, and hope to see you next time.